Hi, everyone. We are back with another edition of the Savvy Adjuster podcast from Alpine Intel. This is the go-to show for industry experts to discuss insurance topics that matter most to adjusters and, of course, other insurance professionals. I'm your host, Chris Nichols, Alpine Intel Sales Operations Manager. Now, at Alpine Intel, we are dedicated to delivering solutions across the property, auto, liability, even workers' comp insurance fields. And we do help with complex claims that include a variety of property items such as specialty electronics, HVAC systems, even the structures themselves. During our last episode, we did talk about claims related to dental equipment with Corporate Vice President Bob Carbon and Vice President of Engineering Mikey Miner of Alpine Intel's TechLoss Consulting and Restoration. But this time, they are back to talk about smoke and fire impacts to business critical equipment. It goes without saying, gentlemen, but thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for having us, Chris.
We are proud to be here.
Well, a quick disclaimer before we jump in. Each claim is unique, and on this podcast, we do speak in general terms, which is why it's so important to get an expert assessment to make sure you have the facts to make a settlement decision that accounts for all the evidence related to each individual claim. Now, we know from previous podcasts here at the Savvy Adjuster podcast that smoke and fire can certainly impact property in different ways, depending on, say, how close the property was to the actual flames or the exposure that it had to smoke and ash. So, Bob, I'd like to start with you. For those listeners who may have missed those previous episodes on smoke and fire, can you tell us a little bit more about how smoke and fire can impact items that TechLoss looks at in different ways?
Yes, most definitely. So smoke and fire contamination could possess or could pose a very specific problem to the equipment. Smoke contamination. So as a fire burns and plastics and papers burn, sulfates and chlorides are released into the smoke. That smoke settles on equipment and gets drawn into equipment, and over time mixed with moisture to form hydrochloric and sulfuric acids. These acids over time could cause equipment to corrode. So smoke contamination could cause equipment to corrode over time. TechLoss utilizes government standards to identify what smoke contamination level is present and how much time we have to really neutralize that and stabilize that equipment. And from the standpoint of fire itself could pose a problem with heat damage. And so all equipment is designed to operate within very specific temperature ranges. So TechLoss has things we could do while we're on site and as we're talking with different people about fire damage to identify what was the level of heat that was present. And through that information gathering process, we could identify if the heat was maybe too high and maybe the equipment was damaged because of this high level of heat, or if maybe it wasn't exposed to such high heat and therefore heat might not be an issue. So we have things we can look for specifically to identify that.
Sure. And I would imagine, and this is a novice like myself assuming, but I would imagine melting could be a good indication of fire damage as well, correct?
Melting is definitely a thing that you need to be concerned about. And the beautiful thing about melting is it's so obvious. You could look at something and say, yes, it's melted. But when it comes to smoke contamination, you could look at a piece of equipment and not necessarily know what is the potential for corrosion to form from this smoke, because you really can't tell what are the concentrations of the sulfates and chlorides that are present, which is why TechLoss utilizes wipe sampling as part of our on-site process. Mikey, I don't know if you want to touch on wipe sampling a little bit.
Sure. And before I do, I just do want to add also, we've been on multiple losses involving explosions, and the damage from heat from an explosion shows itself in a very different way as damage from heat from a sustained fire. And so that is also something you have to be conscious of when looking at, let's say, electrical wiring that has plastic insulation on it, right? From the wipe standpoint, though, when our engineers are on site, we have a very specific wipe sampling method that we follow in order to remain as scientific as possible. We're taking a sample from a very specific size of the surface, and then we're taking those samples in places that are representative of where it's going to make the most sense to understand the extent of the contamination to all the equipment, right? So some of it's going to be external surfaces, some internal surfaces, some maybe closer to a fan that draws in that smoke. And we're going to send those samples off in the appropriate manner to maintain their integrity to a lab, and the lab will provide us with those results. And then we analyze those and interpret them to understand, like Bob had mentioned, the Department of Energy standards and what is considered necessary to require decontamination to prevent long-term or short-term issues. And then in addition, for the insurance world, what actually returns something to a pre-loss condition, right? It may not have long-term effects with concerns for that, but still have to remove it from a smell or discoloration standpoint, or even just, to really purely hit that 100% pre-loss condition.
Sure. And Bob was mentioning about some indications that, or some things that would indicate smoke and fire damage, the melting, the soot, the corrosion. But Mikey, I'll stay with you for this question. I would imagine that some of these, even though it is involving fire, maybe the damages aren't fire related, correct? I mean, could damages be sustained by, say, a fire suppression system or efforts to kind of put out the fire?
Definitely, definitely. We see that quite often, whether it's with a fire extinguisher that somebody in the business used locally, which oftentimes is like a foam or powder based. We see it quite often with the firefighting efforts where they're, introducing a significant amount of water, and similarly from a sprinkler system. But then in those firefighting efforts, a lot of times debris gets introduced into and onto the equipment, whether that's, tearing down a ceiling above, or the insulation in the ceiling above falling down onto the equipment. So it's more than just the smoke contamination itself that we have to be conscious of, and really understand what those materials are made of and how those chemicals and other contaminants can affect the operation and long-term life of the equipment.
Sure. And Bob, I'll switch back to you. And in our previous episode, specifically kind of focused on dental equipment, you had made mention that sometimes people just think they have to replace everything, right? In a claim. So I kind of want to touch on this for a little bit. After a fire event, I'm assuming some policyholders do think they have to replace everything. It's a pretty catastrophic thing that has happened, right? A big fire. But what are some actions that insureds and adjusters can take before making that decision to replace everything?
Definitely. So, following a loss like this, it's really important to look at the equipment in an objective way to understand what was the impact on the equipment, and really how bad are the damages and what needs to be done to get that equipment to a pre-loss condition. And TechLoss has the ability to look at a piece of equipment, and we could, using our experience and background, we could apply some general costs and general procedures to determine, is it worthwhile to have this equipment repaired, or is it damaged beyond beyond repair and in need of replacement? So we can look at something and gather the information to put forward some discussion with the adjusters. We could identify which path do we follow, repair versus replacement. And then we would also take into consideration factors such as business interruption. And as I mentioned in the last episode, what are the requirements? Are there maintenance agreements in place? Is the equipment leased maybe from somebody, and does a lease holder have certain requirements that need to be fulfilled? We take everything into account, and we can provide clarity as far as, here's the best process for moving forward, and here's how you resolve this technology portion of the claim.
Yeah, and we mentioned it at the beginning of each episode, but it is really, each claim is like a snowflake. It's very unique, and so that's why it's so important for adjusters to get a professional outfit like TechLoss to come and do that full inspection, because again, it's pretty valuable when everything is being claimed and maybe only 50% of it has to be replaced. The other 50 can be brought back to pre-loss conditions. So no, that's great. I appreciate you giving us some good reminders to our listeners as far as what they should do. So just like the last episode, we do end with maybe some stories from the field of assignments TechLoss has completed related to smoke and fire losses. Certainly not required, but Mikey, I'll start with you. Do you have any smoke or fire losses that are kind of unique or stand out that you've been a part of?
Yeah, it really has run the gamut. There's a lot of situations we've been involved with different types of equipment, different types of facilities. Like I mentioned before, some of those being high-end, large explosions where the ATF is involved. Other being, very minimal smoke contamination on equipment, and the insured really wondering like, hey, I need to get up and running. Can I just go ahead and use this? And so needing to be involved in helping them to understand, what the ramifications of that would be. I think one of the most interesting situations that I was ever in involving smoke was in a very large manufacturing plant where there was an explosion, and the explosion ended up damaging an entire wing of that plant, but the remainder of the plant had to continue operating, right? They had to find a way to keep as many of those lines running as possible. And so as we were in there doing our evaluation and multiple other vendors and entities were in there, we had to be working around a active plant. And so it was very much be conscious of a situation I'm not used to. And a lot of times I'm going into a building where there are no employees anymore. There's been a fire. It's quiet. It's dark. This was a very active, look out for forklifts, look out for chain hoists that are flying by from the ceiling, look out for lifts from industrial hygienists taking measurements off the ceiling and the walls. And so I found that to just be a very different environment for me as an engineer to be walking through, because my background isn't in a manufacturing facility of industrial equipment, right? So yeah, to me, that was always just like, oh, I feel very out of my element.
That's a unique one for sure. Bob, how about you? Obviously vast experience on your end as well. Any smoke or fire assessments that kind of are unique or stand out in your mind that our listeners may be interested in hearing about?
Yeah, most definitely. And like you said, each situation is like a snowflake, and they are all very, very unique and different. But I will, I do remember a situation where I got a loss in. It was a fire loss, and I remember reading the description, and they were talking about how they used water from the stream next to the building to help put out the fire. And then there was a certain kind of insulation in the ceiling that had mineral spirits in it. And the equipment ended up being exposed to some very corrosive water and chemicals. And I was literally out there the next day to perform my inspection, and every single piece of equipment had corrosion to the point that every single piece needed to be replaced. There was nothing that was not corroded. And the reason why I bring this up, this is really the exception and not the rule, but it just really helps to hammer home the point. When we're dealing with a situation with smoke, with water, with equipment, time is of the essence. The faster you allow an expert to get out there and evaluate things, stabilize things, and provide guidance on how to move forward, the better off you are. In our industry, unfortunately, contents, which is what we deal with primarily, are not necessarily the first thing that adjusters think about focusing on. However, contents account for millions and millions and millions of dollars of product. I'm on a project now. I was brought in 7 days after the fact to do my inspection. I got out there and there was in excess of $10 million in equipment that had corroded in that 7-day period. Time is of the essence. The faster we're out there, the better we can control things, the better we could help to restore things, the more confidence we keep with the insured. And we end up, it's not about saving money, but we end up ultimately saving money for our clients because things are not spinning out of control.
Yeah. We've covered a lot of topic corrosion, explosions today. Who knew? When you tune into the Savvy Adjuster podcast, you're going to get your money's worth here. But no, I appreciate those examples. That's very interesting. And yeah, Bob, to your point, we had a handful of fire-related podcasts, as mentioned, and the spoliation of evidence is huge, right? And so to get on site as quick as possible, certainly a benefit for using a company like TechLoss. So it has been a pleasure, again, talking with the both of you and hearing more about smoke and fire. So again, thank you both for joining us here today.
Thank you for the opportunity, Chris. We appreciate it. And Mikey, thank you.
Well, Alpine Intel's suite of services, as a reminder, is available to help insurance professionals handling fire-related claims. So if you want to find out more about our suite of services, you can either check our show notes or you can go to our website and check out our resources library at alpineintel.com. A ton of great information for you up there. If you're joining us for the first time, by the way, make sure to subscribe to the Savvy Adjuster podcast so you never miss an episode. And if you've listened to us before, we appreciate it. Thanks again for listening, and we will see you next time.